A nation lost in transphobia. A generation crushed by mind-altering psychotherapeutic reality blockers. From the Manhattan Institute comes filmmaker Christopher Rufo.
The transgender movement has conquered American life. Activist teachers have converted classrooms into propaganda. Influencers are driving billions of social media impressions, and doctors are cutting up kids in the name of gender-affirming care. The story goes deeper than you might imagine, featuring rage-filled intellectuals, a trans billionaire benefactor, and large-scale medical experiments in a Detroit ghetto. This is the story of the transgender empire, how it came into being, and how it hopes to change the face of American society forever. In the late 1980s, a group of writers, including Judith Butler, Gail Rubin, Sandy Stone, and Susan Stryker, established the disciplines of queer theory and transgender studies. They argued that gender was a social construct used to oppress racial and sexual minorities. They denounced the categories of man and woman as a false binary that upholds a system of heteronormativity, the white, male, heterosexual power structure. These writers made the case that these systems must be ruthlessly deconstructed and turned to dust. And the most visceral, dramatic way to achieve this is transgenderism. If a man can become woman, if a woman can become man, they believed, the entire structure of creation could be toppled. In a different era, Marxists spoke of the construction of a new socialist man as a crucial task in the broader process of socialist construction. Today, in a time of both rising fascism and an emergent socialist movement, our challenge is transsexualizing our Marxism. We should think of the project of transition to communism in our time as including the transition to new communist selves, new ways of being and relating to one another. This is the great project of the transgender movement, to abolish the distinctions of man and woman, to transcend the limitations established by creation, to hitch the personal struggle of trans individuals to the political struggle of revolution. All of society must be reorganized to affirm their identities and, more importantly, their politics. So how did the trans movement suddenly move from the fringes to the center of public life? Because they built one of the most sophisticated ideological pipelines in American politics. It begins with a flood of cash. In recent years, some of the wealthiest people in the country have spent enormous sums of money subsidizing the trans movement. Jennifer Pritzker is one of them. Pritzker, born James Pritzker in 1950, served a career in the United States military and inherited a sizable part of the Hyatt Hotel fortune. In 2013, Pritzker announced a male-to-female gender transition. The newspaper celebrated Pritzker as the first trans billionaire, and almost immediately, Pritzker began donating untold millions to universities, schools, hospitals, and activist organizations to promote queer theory and trans medical experiments. Meanwhile, Pritzker's cousin, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, signed legislation pushing radical gender theory in the state education curriculum and directing state Medicaid funds towards transgender surgeries. Here's Governor Pritzker speaking to an audience of trans activists.
Tonight I'm here to say that our state government is firmly on your side. We're going to make sure that all transgender Illinoisans are ensured their basic human rights and that health care services are provided to them so that they can thrive.
Here's how the scheme works in practice. Pritzker funded activists at Chicago's largest children's hospital, provide local schools with training, materials, and personnel promoting child gender transitions, using the reputation of the hospital to provide their ideology with a scientific veneer. Nullification is the pursuit of the Latin nullum, meaning nothing. And that is exactly where trans ideology ends. A profound nihilism that denies human nature and enables barbarism in the name of progress. Although this movement enjoys a certain measure of elite support, there is no doubt it will end in tragedy. Jennifer Pritzker, Maureen Connolly, and Blair Peters occupy the heights of power and prestige, but like Dr. Victor Frankenstein, they will learn a hard lesson. No matter how advanced their castration machines become, the trans activists and doctors cannot abolish the reality of man and woman. They cannot transcend the limitations of creation, and to the extent that they try, they will elicit the same heartbreak and alienation captured in the final scene of Mary Shelley's novel. The hulking monster, shunned by society and betrayed by his father, filled with suicidal despair, drifting off into the ice floes, a symbol of Promethean hubris meeting its final consequence.
To close the case against a smug, arrogant Ivy League Yale leftist, U.S. Congressman Dan Crenshaw brings Dr. Meredith McNamara to a stunned silence.
The questions are for Dr. McNamara. I just want to ask you, honestly, you're not concerned about the unknown effects of puberty blockers, hormones, and surgical interventions in kids, the long-term effects, not concerned about that?
Everything I've said here today comes from a place of deep honesty and conviction for the care that I provide and the community that I'm a part of.
You've said that we've cherry-picked data. How do you mean how do you mean that?
So it is very unscientific and flawed to pick a single study or a single statistic and to discuss it in isolation.
Totally agree.
Medical experts are able to talk about all of the evidence as a whole.
Totally agree. So it's good to look at systematic reviews, right? That's the gold standard of evidence when you're trying to understand whether something works or whether it doesn't. So the British Journal of Medicine looked at 61 systematic reviews with the conclusion that, quote, there is great uncertainty about the effects of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries in young people. Journal of Endocrine Society came up with the same conclusion, even the American Academy of Pediatrics. They all cite the lack of evidence. And so here's the thing. If you're doing a therapy and it's, temporary, whatever, fine, maybe let's try it. Let's see if it works. But when you're talking about permanent physiological changes, do you not agree, just from an ethical standpoint, that you might want extremely strong evidence of the benefits? And there is no systematic review that states that there is strong evidence of benefits.
Sir, are you aware of how the quality evidence grading system works and how it's applied?
Yeah, we read through it. That's why I'm citing these journals. So which journal says something different? We should have that debate. Tell me a journal that has done systematic reviews that cites different evidence, that cites strong evidence for benefits of these therapies.
The standards of care were developed based on extensive...
You're not telling me any journal. You're not telling me any study. Don't say standards of care.
Yeah. So...
tell me one.
The standards of care.
That's the standards of care. That's not a journal. That's not a study. That's not an organization. That's not an institution. You're just saying words. Name one study. My daughter's going to grow up with a father with one eye. And at some point she might say, I want one eye. Right? I identify as somebody with one eyeball. Which, by the way, is far less important than your gender, just physiologically speaking. And so if I take her to the doctor and I say, can you just enucleate that eye for us because she identifies as a one eye, she wants to be just like her dad. What would the doctor say? They'd say, you're crazy and I'm going to have you arrested.
With a message of lucidity and common sense and forging a path to national sanity, author, lecturer, and fearless advocate of a return to intellectual integrity in academia, Dr. Miriam Grossman appeared before the United States Congress to refute the unsubstantiated rhetoric of those who have been mutilating innocent youth in America.
Thank you for the opportunity to address you. My name is Miriam Grossman. I am a board-certified child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, author, and senior fellow at Do No Harm. I have been taking care of patients for 45 years. I'm going to use my time to respond to Dr. McNamara. First, I'm struck by her use of the phrase, sex assigned at birth. Sex is not assigned at birth. Sex is established at conception, and it's recognized at birth, if not earlier. Dr. McNamara claims that her views are science-based, but to claim that sex is assigned at birth is without any scientific basis whatsoever. Its language misleads people, especially children, into thinking that male and female are arbitrary designations and can change. That is simply not true. Dr. McNamara claims that social and medical interventions are the only evidence-based treatment and that scientific evidence shows it is life-saving. Without it, she's warning us, kids will commit suicide. Well, a growing number of countries have effectively banned the care to which she's referring. And thank God there's been no wave of suicides or other mental health catastrophes. 3 years ago, Finland placed strict limitations on medical interventions for minors. Sweden did the same thing after a 14-year-old girl was found to have osteoporosis and spinal fractures from puberty blockers. An investigation concluded, quote, the risks of anti-puberty and hormone treatment for those under 18 currently outweigh the possible benefits. The UK conducted a review and called the evidence very low. They've also placed severe restrictions on the care that Dr. McNamara calls life-saving. Norway also analyzed the data and has made similar changes in policy. The National Academy of Medicine in France warned, quote, great medical caution must be taken in children and adolescents, given the vulnerability of this population and the many undesirable, even serious complications the therapies cause. Doctors in New Zealand and Australia have published similar statements. Is Dr. McNamara suggesting that all these countries are rejecting evidence-based treatment and placing their kids at risk of suicide? Regarding that point of view, Finland's gender expert, Dr. Rita Kaltiela, said, quote, it's purposeful disinformation, the spreading of which is irresponsible. All 7 countries, and Florida too, of course, concluded that kids don't need their development interrupted, the girls don't need their periods stopped and their voices lowered, and the boys don't need to grow breasts. What they need is psychotherapy. I have other objections to Dr. McNamara's testimony. She insists that her position, only hers, represents standard medical care. What she doesn't want you to know is that there is no standard. There's a debate. There's a fierce debate. And on the side opposite her stand such prominent figures as Stephen Levine, Kenneth Zucker, Paul McHugh, and James Cantor, among others. These doctors are giants in the field. They have been treating transgender patients and gathering data and publishing papers about them, and I mean no disrespect here, but since before Dr. McNamara was born. The point is that those veteran clinicians and others who have wisdom and experience are ignored because they disagree with the current narrative. They're against medical interventions for the same reason those 7 countries are. There is no evidence of long-term benefit, but there is evidence of harm. I'll end by quoting Jamie Reed, the courageous whistleblower from the Children's Gender Clinic in St. Louis. I believe that hospital receives the medical education funding that we're discussing today. She said that doctors at that clinic said, we are building the plane while we are flying it. We are building the plane while we are flying it. That's how they described the treatment at their gender clinic. Our precious tax dollars should not support such a perilous experiment.
We close by reflecting on the events in this past week as Oklahoma's Governor Stitt announced that this foolishness would no longer find a resting place in Oklahoma.
Oklahomans are fed up with attempts to confuse the word woman and turn it into some kind of ambiguous, perverted definition that harms our real women. You know, Oklahomans are like, Governor, enough is enough. This is crazy. Oklahomans know what a woman is. And by signing the Women's Bill of Rights into law, we're recognizing women's rights are endowed by our Creator. As many of you know, we've been fighting this fight for a while. Our efforts are relentless. I signed, I think it was last year or the year before, the Save Women in Sports Bill, which is just basically ensures fairness in women athletics. We pulled funding from the hospitals performing sexual reassignment surgeries on our minors. And then I was so excited. Thank you for some of the legislature for being here today. We put that into law. We made sure that in our schools, boys use boys' bathrooms and girls are going to use girls' bathrooms. And if any of you were governor and you had to take the phone calls from the moms and the dads that called me and said, Governor, my fifth grader is so scared to go to the bathroom right now for what's happening. So we're glad to be able to get this common sense done. And today I will proudly put my signature on the Women's Bill of Rights executive order to extend our protection of women at the state level. Today, we take another step to preserve the integrity of women's spaces and opportunities, okay? We are making sure that women's spaces are safe for women. No men are going to go into women's prisons in the state of Oklahoma. No men in women's domestic shelters in the state of Oklahoma. No men in women's locker rooms. No men in women's bathrooms. No men in women's sports.